Once again, welcome everybody. My name is Peter Larson. I'm the chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, and I'm thrilled to have a short program today talking about the situation of the arrest and interrogation, detention of Palestinian children by Israeli forces. Today's program is put on by the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine in conjunction with a campaign called the Canada Stand Up for Palestinian Human Rights campaign. Our agenda is fairly simple. There's this little welcome and acknowledgement. We were just before we started the seminar, we're talking about Indigenous issues in Canada and the parallel between the truth and reconciliation process that we are starting to go through in Canada and the need for some comparable process in Israel-Palestine. I'm going to then give a short background with some maps and so on, just so we know all what we're talking about. And then we have a very short 3-minute video about the issue of children in detention by prepared by Defense of Children International. Then at 12:15, we'll introduce and have our two speakers, Salwa Duebas with Military Court Watch and Dani Shenhar of Hamoked of the Israeli Center for the Defense of the Individual. They will be introduced a bit more in a minute. We will have questions and answers after the discussion with the panelists from the audience, and we'll adjourn at 1:30. Just in case some of you may remember, this is a famous case of a Palestinian child taken into Israeli detention. Ahed Tamimi was 15 at the time. She was sentenced to prison for slapping an Israeli soldier after her brother had been shot on her property. I think it became famous because the action was caught on video and went viral, and she was given an 8-month sentence by the Israeli detention court system. Let me start off with a quick review of the geography of the area. For some people, for many people watching today, this will be superfluous, but just in case not everybody is aware, I think it's useful to just start off with some very basic information. If you look on the screen, the whitish area that starts here at Gaza down to the Gulf of Aqaba at the bottom, going all the way up here, that is what Canada recognizes as the state of Israel. And inside that, there's about 8.5 million people, of whom 7 million are Jews, and 1.8 million Palestinian citizens of Israel. The city of Jerusalem is right in the middle. Both of our speakers are from Jerusalem, Ramallah, which is right in this area here. It has a total population of 1 million people, which includes about 250,000 Israeli settlers in East Jerusalem. Then this area here called the West Bank up here, it's called, and I didn't know this until my first trip to the area, it's called the West Bank because it is the West Bank of the Jordan River. The Jordan River flows from the Sea of Galilee down into the Dead Sea. So that's the West Bank here, this kidney-shaped geographical area. And then down here in this corner is Gaza. The West Bank has a population of about 3.5 million people, of whom something over 500,000 are Jewish settlers. And then, of course, there's another 2 million Palestinians living in Gaza. We won't be talking about them today. These numbers are all approximate. Some of them overlap one with the other, but they give you orders of magnitude. So now this is a closer look at Israel-Palestine. It's clipped off a little bit of the top and the bottom, but the yellow area is what international rules call the occupied Palestinian territory. That kidney-shaped area on the right is the West Bank, plus Gaza City, Gaza on the left. Palestinian children that we're going to be talking about today live in this area, in this kidney-shaped area, in one of the many, many hundreds of little villages and East Jerusalem and some towns like Nablus in the West Bank. They are arrested, they're interrogated, they're tried, and then if they are convicted, and it has a very high conviction rate, then they are imprisoned. So this is the areas where they're arrested or living is in this yellow area, where they are taken for interrogation to a number of interrogation centers. They're named here. These interrogation centers around here, these 2, 3, so on. Most of them are in in the middle of Israeli settlements, like Ariel, for example, has gates all around the outside, as does Gush Etzion, and so on. And then after they're interrogated, they're taken to court, and there are the courts are listed are here. Ophir Military Court, and here's Ophir is here. Salem Military Court is up here, and then they're sent to prison. And 2 of the prisons are in Israel, and 1 is in the West Bank. The significance of them being in Israel, of course, is that their families mostly cannot cross the barrier. So the kids, once they're in prison in Israel, their families can't visit them as a general rule. Just a few explanations are perhaps useful about the rules that apply in the West Bank. It's different than the rules that apply inside Israel. Palestinians living in the West Bank live under a different set of rules, and the Israeli Jews living in the West Bank also live under different rules. So for the Jews, of whom there's somewhere around 600,000, living in dozens and dozens of Jewish-only settlements, Israel considers them to be citizens of Israel, and they live under Israeli law. Now, for an Israeli citizen of Israel, Israeli law is roughly comparable to Canadian law, habeas corpus, and so on and so forth. Although Canada says all the settlements are illegal under international law. However, if you're a Palestinian living in the West Bank, one of the 3 million or so Palestinians living in the West Bank, their situation is different. They live under military rule, and the normal protections that we've come to see in Canada don't apply. The same protections that apply to Israeli citizens living in the West Bank. These folks, these kids, are subject to what Israelis call administrative detention, by which means they can be held indefinitely and sentenced to jail without any charges, trial, or due process. And the best analogy I could think of from Canada perspective, it's as if there was a War Measures Act going on continuously in the West Bank. Many of us are old enough to remember the War Measures Act, which in Canada really was only ever applied in Quebec. So our discussion today will be there'll be 3 Canadian panelists who will be talking to 2 experts, 1 Palestinian and 1 Israeli. Reverend Mariana Harris is a retired United Church minister. She's taken several trips to Israel and Palestine. She's very involved with the Canada Stand Up for Palestinian Human Rights campaigns, and she divides her life between Ontario and Vancouver. The second panelist is Kathy Bergen. She's a justice and peace activist. She's lived and worked in Palestine for 17 years and on this issue since 1982. She currently lives in Kitchener, Ontario. And the third panelist is Reverend Dr. Dorcas Gordon, who is a retired Presbyterian minister. She was principal and professor of biblical interpretation and preaching at Knox College, University of Toronto. She also frequently leads study tours to Palestine, and she lives in Newcastle, Ontario. We're shortly going to speak with our Jerusalem-based experts. There are 2 of them. One is Salwa Duebas. Salwa is a Palestinian citizen of Israel and the co-founder of an organization called Military Court Watch, which monitors the treatment of Palestinian children in military detention. And she'll tell us about the impact on Palestinian families and the difficulties teens face after their imprisonment. And Kathy Bergen will be asking her some questions about that. Our other invited guest, who we're thrilled to have, is a man called Dani Shenhar. He's an Israeli who lives now in Jerusalem. He's from Hamoked, the Center for the Defense of the Individual. And he will be explaining the difference in laws governing Palestinian and Israeli youth living in the West Bank. So that's the end of my introductory part. We are now going to look at a little video, if I can organize this properly here. So let me just see if I can do the share screen. One little introductory video, share sound. It is a 1 minute and 42-second video.
اسمع انا بمسك لك اياه وبروح معك عمو ماشي انا بحكي
في صوت خبط باكي طلعت الجندي بيصحي فيك بيقول لي قوم يا حبيبي تعال معي
كان في مواجهة
بعديها عرفت أتفرج مع وقت اللي بيطلع لي فيلم.
حتى نجم الدكاترة وأول إشي عالجوا الكلب، بعدين الأمير مسكوه وزتوه في الجيب. دخلنا أول إشي على المستعمرة، قعدت على كنت الشاشة تحتي بس كان كثر.
بلشت سياسة الضرب يعني في السيارة، يخبطوا فيا يعني لدرجة إنه وجع. بلش يقول شلت الواعي، بلش يفتش الوعية وهذا. أنا مشلت، طلعت على البوسطة، طلعنا في البوسطة وأنا مشلت، خليت تقريبا 4 ساعات في البوسطة. 4 ساعات يعني تجمدت، يعني صرت ثلج الآدم.
قعدنا هنا، بعدين صار يضرب علي في حجاب، وكان رايح وجاي يضرب. بعد يمكن 5 ساعات جينا وطلعنا على السوق.
Okay, I think I have to make sure that yeah, it's going to continue. Hold on for a second. I got to it's going to keep on playing. Hold on for a second while I figure out how to do that. Yeah. Okay. Now. Sorry for that. I think we're back on. Also, Marianne, I think I had asked you to say a word or two to introduce that little clip. I forgot to do so. Do you have some? I'd like to invite your folks to light up your video screens now. And Marianne, did you want to say something in retrospect? I'm sorry, I forgot to ask you to say that. So.
No, that's fine. I think it's a very telling video, and you are able to watch the whole film online. If you would like to do that, we'll send you a link to that. It's an excellent production that they've done.
Looks pretty gruesome. Thank you, Mariana. Okay, so as I said before, we're going to start off with Kathy Bergen. Kathy, you need to unmute yourself, and Salwa as well. Kathy's going to, Salwa's going to make a little presentation. Kathy's going to ask her some questions, and then afterwards we're going to proceed to Dani and Dorcas. But Kathy and Salwa, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Hi, Salwa.
Hi, Kathy.
Welcome to Canada.
Thank you. I wish.
Peter has already said several things about you, so I won't repeat those. But it's really great to see you, and it's great to have you on this webinar. As he said, you are a Palestinian citizen of Israel. You were born in Nazareth. And I got to know you when I was living over there. And at one point, I remember going to one of the families of one of the children who had just been released with you, which was a very enlightening and very, very difficult experience for me. So we're really, really glad to have you. I have 2 questions for you. And I think what I'll do is ask both of them, and you could spend a few minutes talking about Military Court Watch, how it came into being. I know we all know now you're a co-founder of Military Court Watch, but why was it established and what is it doing? So if you could spend a few minutes on that. We have 15 minutes in total. And then the second question you could just go on to, and it would be about talking about how are the children affected, going to prison and then coming out? How are their families affected? And how does this affect the greater society? I learned a lot about that when I was there with you, but if you could just elaborate on that. And like I say, we have about 15 minutes. Thanks.
Okay, shall I start?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you for organizing this webinar and for taking part. Military Court Watch is a Palestinian human rights organization that focuses on one issue. It monitors the treatment of children in Israeli military detention. And we also advocate for the full implementation of their legal rights without discrimination. We basically focus on the first 24 hours of arrest because that is when most allegations of abuse and ill treatment happens. And we monitor 13 issues of concern. I'll name some of them. So we monitor the place and time of arrest. We monitor whether the child was hand-tied, whether he or she were blindfolded, whether they were transferred on the floor of a military vehicle, whether they were physically or verbally abused, whether they were threatened with anything. Most importantly, whether they were informed of their right to silence, whether they had access to a lawyer prior to interrogation, whether a parent was present during the questioning, whether they were coerced into signing a document written in Hebrew, which is a language they don't understand, and whether they were strip searched and humiliated in the process. And based on the evidence that we collect, we basically, every year we collect about 100 testimonies from children all over the West Bank and monitor these 13 issues. And we basically call for 6 recommendations summarizing these issues of concern. So we believe that arresting children should be a measure of last resort. And if it has to happen, it has to happen during daytime, because as you can imagine, night arrests are terrifying. I will talk more about it later. Each child should be informed in writing in a language that he or she understands of their rights prior to interrogation. They should be allowed to consult with a lawyer also prior to interrogation. They should be accompanied by an adult parent, preferably maybe someone else if the parent is not available. Every interrogation should be audio-visually recorded, because this cuts out a lot of, allegations. So if really no abuse is taking place, then why not record it? And then a copy of the audio, visual audio recording should be given to the lawyer for consideration. And then finally, and I think most importantly, if any of the above are not respected, then the prosecution should be discontinued and the child should be released, because otherwise there will be no incentive for respecting the top 5 recommendations.
Salwa, can I ask just
a
simple question? You say you monitor all those things, but you can't, like, when you say you monitor, you mean you talk to the kids afterwards, or you can't really climb in the Jeep to see if they're being beaten up or whatever? So what's monitoring mean?
Very good question. We're not with the child at the time of arrest, obviously, and we don't have access to the children in prison, because we don't represent children. Only their lawyers are allowed to have access to them. So what we do is we wait for the child to be released, and then we take testimony from the child with, very structured style to make sure that we cover all these 13 issues of concern, and we have answers to each and every single one of them.
Thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
Great, thank you so much. That's very helpful. Could you now talk a little bit about how the imprisonment of the children, of any of the children, in general, would affect their families, their peers, the children themselves, and also about the greater society that they are then coming back into?
Sure. Before I do that, I would like to give you a little bit of context. So I said we collect a lot of evidence, about 100 testimony each year, and our evidence over the years shows a very strong link between a strong geographical link between child arrest and the illegal Israeli settlements scattered all over the West Bank. So on average, majority of the children are arrested or live within about 800 meters from an Israeli settlement or a road used by a settlement. And this is a very important link. The other issue to pay attention to is also based on the evidence that we collect is the majority of children, more than half of them, are arrested in terrifying night raids in the middle of the night. So it starts with a bang at the aggressive bang at the front door. In some cases, the door is blown off its hinges using a controlled explosive device. Sometimes even more terrifying, the door is open using a special device which quietly opens a locked door. And the family is in bed asleep, and all they know is there's a group of soldiers, some of them wearing masks, you cannot read their expressions, in the middle of a bedroom or the living room. And the trauma starts from there. Night raids are terrifying experiences. Sometimes the soldiers would go in accompanied by police dogs. One mother told me her daughters woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of heavy breathing in the room, and they looked, and it was 2 service dogs with 3 soldiers. Sometimes the soldiers will conduct a search of the house. Sometimes they will tell the family what they're looking for. Other times they don't even tell them what they're looking for. And they would cause deliberate damage to the simple furniture that these people have, slitting mattresses, pulling curtains, throwing things off the shelves, breaking things. And this, as you can imagine, creates a lot of tension. Usually the mother and the younger children are separated into one room, the older boys and the father into another room. Mothers tell me how they sit in this house in one room as if they are prisoners. They hear sounds and voices and commotion. They're unable to interfere or see what is happening. Sometimes there's physical abuse. Sometimes there's verbal abuse. And then within, I don't know, half an hour to maybe 2 hours, the soldiers will leave. About 30 of them might go into a house, sometimes less, sometimes more. And a child maybe is arrested. So if it's a child, the child will be taken in a military jeep, tied and blindfolded. In many cases, the child will be thrown on the metal floor of the vehicle. In Israel, it is, of course, every other country, it's mandatory to wear a seatbelt. So soldiers will be probably wearing seatbelts, but not the child. The child will be on the metal floor, on bumpy roads. Some of you who were in the West Bank know how bumpy the roads are. And then he will be questioned. I mean, I don't have time to go into the whole process, but the child will be questioned in a coercive manner. The interrogator is usually a big man who's intimidating, thumping the table, shouting, threatening the child. If you don't confess, I will arrest your mother and father. If you don't confess, I will spread rumors in your village that you are a collaborator. If you don't confess, I will revoke the work permit of your father and you won't have enough money. And the majority of these children will end up confessing. And once you confess, you go to court and there will be a plea bargain. The interrogators or the system will make it look like it is a good deal, because part of the process is to keep adding to the charge sheet, to ramp it up, to scare you. So if you are accused of throwing stones and you don't confess, the interrogator will say, okay, I accuse you of throwing a Molotov cocktail, or of shooting, or of manufacturing pipe bombs. And the boy is terrified and he will say, okay, I will confess to throwing stones because I'm terrified of the other allegations. And it doesn't really matter.
Salwa, can I just ask you, for people who may not know, how old in general are these children that are arrested then?
So they can be arrested as young as 12 and until 17. So once you're 18, you're no longer a child. And so majority end up confessing. Most children will have 3 aspects to their sentence. You know, a custodial sentence, they will spend time in prison. It varies. It can be years, it can be 6 months, 4 months. I would say the average these days is 4 months. Your family will be fined a huge amount by local standard. These are very poor families, so thousands of shekels. And then there will be a suspended sentence, which means if you're arrested again in the near, you know, let's say it's 5 years, you will end up in prison for, like, let's say, I don't know, 10 months before you're even tried for the new allegation. So it's got a huge deterrent and you know, terrifying aspect of this sentence. Let me move on to what happens when the child is released. So the child is released 4 to 6 months. He comes home. The family are very happy. They throw a party. They invite family and friends, cook the best food, hang a banner with his photograph in front of the house. It will be a festival, thinking that the nightmare had ended. But almost as soon as the party is over, they realize that the nightmare had just started. Mothers tell me how the boy's behavior is changed. He becomes more aggressive towards his parent, towards his siblings, towards people around him. He rebels. He doesn't take advice from the parents. He doesn't listen to them. He spends time isolating himself in his own bedroom. He becomes antisocial. Many of these boys will sleep during the day and wake up at night, which is a sign of depression, a sign of somebody who doesn't have something to look forward to do during the day. Many of these boys will drop out of school for a number of reasons. One of them is spending 4 to 6 months in prison. If you're in 9th, 10th, 11th grade, is a long time to catch up with schoolwork, with hardly any meaningful education in prison. The second reason is, I mean, maybe I should have mentioned this, but the system relies heavily on informants who are embedded in the Palestinian society. So this boy's come back home and he doesn't want to go to school because he knows one of the boys around him, maybe from his school, maybe from his neighborhood, gave his name to the authorities, and that is why he ended up in prison. So he is mistrustful of people around him. Even worse, he knows that other boys in his school or neighborhood don't trust him because he spent time in prison. He was interrogated. Maybe he became an informer. He already gave some names or some information. So the boy comes home after 4 to 6 months, wanting to reintegrate, pick his life up, and he finds the exact opposite, that he's ostracized, that he's scared, that he is mistrustful. I said that the majority of boys will end up pleading guilty, and that is basically the quickest way out of the system. So if you say, I don't accept the plea bargain, I want to challenge based on the evidence, you will end up spending more time in prison. So the majority of the boys are advised by their lawyers, by their parents, to plead guilty, whether they've done something or they haven't done something. So for those boys who end up pleading guilty for something they did not do, their understanding of the world around them is turned upside down. They know there's no longer cause and effect. There's no red line. You know, we all know that nobody should be punished if they haven't done something wrong. These boys insist they haven't done anything wrong, yet they had to plead guilty and spend time in prison. This, in my opinion, affects their psychology, affects the way they will relate to people around them in the future, to their spouses, to their parents, people at work. If there's no red line that is, you know, is not violated or not passed, it will be very difficult to conduct a normal life and to live, you know, in a healthy community. The terrifying experience is not simply, you know, for the boys. The entire family is terrified. I mentioned that there's a strong geographic link between child arrest and settlements. So if you're a village, built near a settlement was built on land belonging to a Palestinian village, it's very likely that your house will be raided and somebody from your family will be arrested. Recent information from the UN estimates that on average, I think about 250 night raids are conducted each month. That's a lot of night raids. Like I think if you multiply it, it's around 3,000 a year. And because these night raids are concentrated mostly in villages and towns next to settlements, a few hundred households, it is not a surprise when families, mothers tell me that each and every single house in their village was raided not once, multiple times. One woman couldn't even remember how many times her own house was raided. She said, I don't remember, dozens of times, when she was a child at her parents' house and when she had her own house. And this, families live with this cloud over their heads. They don't even sleep, even when there's no night raid. Mothers become hypervigilant. They wake up in the middle of the night, interrupted sleep. One mother told me she sleeps by the window because she wants to wake her children up before the army knocks at the door, bangs at the door. Another mother told me she wakes up to the slightest sound around her, anything, a vehicle, anything, a cat passing. And she goes around the house and inspects that everyone is in their bed, safe. Another mother told me they take turns to sleep. So one sleeps until midnight and then wakes up and somebody else take turns, because they want to spare their family, their children, the trauma of being woken up. Mothers suffer from lack of sleep. They wake up tired in the morning. They suffer from some physical symptoms, mental health issues. Mothers who haven't even yet experienced a night raid show the most severe physical symptoms. The younger siblings are affected. To see a soldier in the middle of the house in the middle of the night is terrifying. They cling to their parents. They don't want to sleep in their own bed. They wet their bed after a certain age. Their performance at school is affected. Mothers and fathers feel humiliated. A father who is pushed around by a soldier, made to feel he's insignificant, is a hurt father, is a humiliated father. And this is what the boys come home to, being reminded of the images of the father being pushed by an 18-year-old soldier, the mother crying, locked up in a room, children, younger siblings screaming, terrified. So the trauma or the effect is not simply comes from the child spending time behind bars. There are non-visual bars that affect the child and the entire family for their entire life. The psychological and mental and physical aspects of this experience is traumatic. I cannot emphasize it enough. And this is basically what you need to do. If you're in the business of building settlements in occupied territory, in order to protect these settlements and in order for settler mothers and fathers to go to work each day, wake up fresh in the morning, take kids to school, go to work, you have to make sure that Palestinian mothers and fathers are kept awake day and night, and that they have to worry about every single day of their lives and about the future of their own children. There's no other way of doing it.
Thank you so much, Salwa. You have just painted a very vivid picture, a very sobering picture of the situation as children get arrested and then released. Thank you so much for speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Salwa, and thank you, Kathy. Before we go on to Dorcas and Dani, I urge everybody to use the Q&A function to ask questions. You can start putting the questions in there now. Dorcas and Dani will be talking for another 15 minutes or so, and then I'll be turning to the list of questions that you have, or maybe Mariana or Dorcas or Kathy will have questions of their own. But first of all, Dorcas and Dani, over to you.
Thank you. Dani, it's my privilege to introduce you, an Israeli, and for the past 4 years, director of the legal department at Hamilped. an Israeli organization focused on the defense of individual human rights. Dani began his time at Hamoked in 2008, seeking to use his legal skills and his knowledge of international law to assist Palestinians living under occupation, which he considers by far to be the most pressing national issue for Israel. Dani holds an LLM in international human rights law, an MSc in international relations, an LLB, and a BA in political science. So you can easily see why Dani, a specialist regarding the legal aspects concerning the prolonged occupation of the Palestinian territories by Israel. And in terms of our topic today, the military detention system, the rules of that detention system, and its effect on Palestinian children. So Dani, it is a pleasure to welcome you, to greet you. We've been on email a number of times, and it's always lovely to see the email person in person, if only virtually. I have a couple of questions like Kathy had for Salwa. And the first is just to ask you to tell us a little bit about Hamoked and the kind of work that you've been involved in briefly since 2008. And then the second question is really to help us to understand the difference in the military law, which governs Palestinian children in the territories, and the civil law, which governs Jewish children living both in the occupied territories and in Israel proper. I have, of course, lots of questions, but let me ask my two right at the beginning.
Just Dani, just before you speak there, Dorcas, when you're speaking, there's a kind of a squeaking noise that's coming behind. Not sure whether it's your chair or something that's rubbing, but yeah, okay. Dani?
I think it may be my husband who's on Zoom beside me, so I'll go on mute.
Okay, Dani, over to you. Sorry.
Thank you, Dorcas. Thank you, everybody, for having me and Salwa today. It's lovely to be with you. I hope I won't have any noise because I hear my kids are back, and I hope they won't make a mess here in the house, but hopefully it'll stay quiet. I want to start by, well, when I was hearing Salwa speak, one of my first job at Hamoked was actually, I was counsel on detainee rights. And as part of my job, I used to visit Palestinian detainees in Israeli prisons all over Israel. And I remember meeting youth, Palestinian minors in detention. For me, was a shocking experience and a very difficult experience. I remember getting home after seeing 3 or 4 kids in prison and feeling so bad. Like, you see kids that don't really understand why they are in prison. Their contact to their family is almost non-existent. And so when they see you, and I would travel with another Palestinian colleague with me, because my Arabic skills aren't as good, and we wanted fluent conversation with the detainees. And speaking to them was just heartbreaking, because you can see that these are kids and they don't really understand what they're doing in jail, why they're in jail, and they really just want to get out of there. They're scared. They're completely, well, I don't want to say helpless, because they did have internal strength, but you see that their system is really working hard on breaking them. And through the years, the reason I've continued working in this field and in Hamoked is that I feel that this is just a horrible way of treating human beings, and I am ashamed that my country is doing this. So I have to say that, because I am an Israeli Jewish citizen, and well, yeah. So I'll start with the legal issue, because it's a bit more, dry, and then I'll try and talk about our work here at Hamoked on the issue of minors in detention. As you stated, there are practically two sets of rules or laws in states in the same geographical area. This system has a name. I won't use the term that everybody knows what I'm talking about, but the legal rules that apply to Palestinian youth being detained in West Bank is military law. And Israeli law, the youth law, which governs Israeli citizens, has safeguards. It is based on the premise that the law should look after the basic rights of the child, the best interests of the child, and some very basic assumptions. Salwa talked about these night raids, these night arrests, which is, I think, the main facet of hardship that Palestinian families face. The youth law, one of the main stipulations in the law is that minors are not to be arrested during nighttime. And the military law, of course, does not have any sort of safeguard against night arrests. Kids are being arrested at night, but the military legal system says we don't interrogate kids during the night. So what happens actually is kids get detained at about 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m. They're being hauled off to some interrogation center and wait while they're inside, outside, get beaten up, get, I don't know, badly treated, and then their interrogation starts only in the morning. So after this ordeal that Salwa talked about in great detail before, what is the outcome of the interrogation, do you think? When a 14-year-old child is detained at 2 o'clock at night after his house is being broken into, his family is terrified, he's taken in his pajamas from his house in a military jeep. All the soldiers around him speak in Hebrew, a language he doesn't speak. He's beaten, he's abused, both verbally and physically. He's thrown into some military installation somewhere in the West Bank, sometimes being interrogated off the cuff by some security agent. And then he arrives at an interrogation after not sleeping, not drinking, not eating, not even going to the toilet sometimes at 8 in the morning or 9 in the morning, facing 3 interrogators. What do you think the outcome of this interrogation would be? Of course, the kid just wants to go get out of there as fast as he can. So he'll practically say anything the interrogators want him to say. So this is the reason why the youth law in Israel stipulates that minors should not be arrested at night. And as we see, the military in the West Bank does not uphold this rule at all. And we see that as a grave, grave problem, grave concern. Hamoked, Military Court Watch, other NGOs in Israel, Palestine have been vividly advocating against this practice. And we actually have a High Court of Justice petition in the Israeli High Court of Justice on this issue pending right now. We had a hearing back in August. The Israeli military has stated that it's conducting a pilot, like some kind of experiment on stopping these night raids. But the numbers that they've given on children that they've summoned to interrogation and not raided their homes is so low. And they've said that they won't summon minors above the age of 16 or minors who were involved in serious offenses. We don't know exactly what it says. So we think that this pilot is not going to go anywhere, and we hope the court will think the same. So this is the main difference between youth law and the military law. In the interrogation center, of course, the youth law, when a minor is interrogated, it stipulates many, many things that the interrogators should adhere to. First of all, the parental presence in the interrogation is a very important thing for the minor. having an adult that he knows present, parent or a sibling, an elder sibling. In the case of the Palestinians, not only that there is no parental presence whatsoever, the parents don't even know where the minor is being taken to. Kids are just kidnapped from their beds. And we know that at Hamoked because we've been assisting the families to trace their loved ones for years now. The military does not give any information to the families. They don't tell them why they're taking the kid, where they're taking the kid, how long their kid is not going to be home. Imagine this. This is terrifying. As a parent to 3 young kids, I can't even imagine the impact this has. And Salwa has talked about that before. So they arrive in this interrogation center, no one there for them. Legal counsel, another basic right of an interrogee, not only of minor, but also an adult. These kids do not get legal counsel before their interrogation. Lately, there has been some kind of change in some police stations in the West Bank. We've seen minors telling us that they've been given a phone with the interrogators telling them, this is a lawyer on the phone, talk to him. He'll tell you, he'll give you advice. But usually the kids don't really understand who they're talking to, what he's telling them. It's not proper legal counsel after a night with no sleep, beating and talking on the phone, over the phone with a person they don't really know. And Salwa also talked about these interrogations being videotaped or audio taped. In many instances, the interrogations are conducted without any audio visual recording, which makes what happens there completely invisible to all of us who are trying to monitor the situation. The teens are not informed of their basic rights prior to the interrogation, or they're given this kind of sheet in Hebrew, which states that they have a right to remain silent, but they don't even understand what it says. Some minors say that they've been told by the interrogators that if they remain silent, they will be convicted. So they have to speak, they have to give names. And compiling all this together, the night arrest, no parents, no legal counsel, no informing of the rights, and you have a 15-year-old child, the outcome of this is clear. You have children confessing to things that they didn't do, being thrown to jail afterwards for many months without being in contact with their families. We have the military courts. It's a joke, like Salwa talked about the plea bargains. Nobody has to work very hard. The Israeli military judicial system to indict and find these kids guilty, because most of them just sign Hebrew papers saying that they did whatever the interrogators told them they have to sign, and say that they did what the interrogators told them to. The interrogators told them to say what they did, and this situation is very, legally speaking, is just it's a travesty of law. So what we've been working on at Hamoked in this regard, first of all, we have this tracing project. Since the families do not know where their loved ones are being taken to, they phone us the next morning, and we try to trace the minors as fast as we can, and give the information to the families for them to know where the child is. And since we have this knowledge where the kids are, sometimes like 4 times a year, we send a lawyer on our behalf to speak to the kids in detention, to take their testimonies and to hear what they have to say about what they've gone through. Regarding their conditions in detention, we facilitate family visits. We try to make the process as speedy as possible. We turn to the Israeli military on behalf of family members and try to have them get permits of entry into Israel, because the minors are being held inside Israel. Also, complete contradiction to international law. So, and since the COVID-19 pandemic started, we've been working hard because there were no family visitations due to the pandemic, and we've, you have minors in prison without any contact to the outside world whatsoever, because they have no phone calls also. We did manage to get the minors one phone call a week at least, and monitoring the situation, seeing that these minors do get one phone call at least. All sorts of complaints about conditions of detention, physical conditions in prison, and due to our comprehensive work on the ground, we have information regarding trends. And so we do try to appeal to the High Court of Justice, usually regarding, like, for example, I told you about the night arrests, and bringing issues up to the highest judicial authority in Israel, trying to alleviate the situation. What Dorcas also asked me about the youth law, of course, one of the big problems that's happening is the neighboring communities, the Palestinian and the settler communities inside the West Bank. The youth there, if they get detained and they live 500 meters apart from each other, they are under completely different rules. The youth law applies to them and not to their Palestinian neighbors. And the High Court of Justice disgracefully upholds this practice, stating that this is based on security grounds and does not deem this as discrimination. So the situation is pretty dire in that respect, and yeah.
Wow, thank you, Dani. Dorcas, did you have a follow-up question you wanted to ask?
Well, I just wondered if Dani would say a few words about administrative detention. I heard about a young man, Amal, 17 years old, who's severely immune deficient and is being held in administrative detention, and it's being renewed. And could you say a few words about that?
Yeah, well, administrative detention is an evil in of itself. It's you detain somebody, put him in jail with no trial, meaning that I think if I remember the data correctly, we have now even 6 minors in administrative detention, meaning that they're in jail with no legal or trial, even though the military courts are very far from perfect. They're flawed completely, but at least, you have a lawyer who sees the evidence. I don't know, there is some kind of oversight. Administrative detention, the military has complete power to put you in jail based on secret evidence that your lawyer cannot see. And you are put in jail for 6-month period based on this order signed by a military commander. And theoretically, it can be renewed with no limit. Usually, we had instances of people in administrative detention for years. Even minors usually don't stay so long in prison, but even like being a year in prison with no charges pressed against you based on secret evidence is contradictory to every notion of justice that we have. And it's being used. The thing is that Israel always claims that this practice is based on international humanitarian law. The Geneva Convention gives it authority to detain people like this, but it states there in the convention that this is supposed to be done in very extreme situations, only when there's the last resort. And Israel uses administrative detention on a very routine basis. Like we have hundreds, I don't know, 400 something, 500 people in administrative detention in every given moment. So this is not, these are numbers, this is mass incarceration, mass administrative detention. And what's interesting is that when you talk with the Israeli military legal experts, they say, well, we're trying to bring in some democratic norms into the military system to make it more compatible with international law or democratic norms. But we see a movement from the occupation law to Israeli law, because we've also started seeing administrative detention used more often inside Israel. And now they're even talking about administratively detaining felons inside Israel, Palestinians mainly, because of the crime rates. So you see that this occupation, this normalcy of administrative detention is starting to affect the Israel proper penal system, which is something that is worrying as well.
Thank you very much, Dani, and thank you. Dorcas, are we okay? Can we?
Yeah, I was just going to say that was the last part was very helpful because I wondered about Palestinian youth inside Israel. So,
yeah, we haven't talked about Jerusalem youth, which is the Jerusalem Palestinians, which is a kind of a sui generis or a special community, because they are Palestinians. They're under occupation under international law. Israel sees them as under Israeli law, but the practice is actually not far from what we see in the West Bank, and this is an issue.
Well, thank you, Dani. Thank you, Dorcas, for that. I can't help but be struck by the fact that you, Dani, are an Israeli and coming at this with an extensive legal background, and Salwa are Palestinian, and you come at obviously with a more of a reason to be personally involved from the fact that we're talking about Palestinian children. My understanding from our conversation prior to this event is that you didn't actually know each other. You had not met each other. And yet your testimonies are very concurrent. I mean, you're looking at this as a binocular view of a problem, and you seem to be very consistent in your assessment of the situation. I think that's quite striking and quite remarkable. I encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A box. I have a number of questions there, and we'll start to move for them. We have a half an hour left here. But one question that I want to lead off with, I'd like each of you to give a short answer on this. To a Canadian, it sounds so terrible. What's your short answer on why this is happening? Is it just meanness? Is it just racism? Or is there some smart people who have an argument about why this is happening? Either of you, what's your assessment? Who wants to try? Salwa.
Maybe I'll go first. I mentioned this in my presentation. In my opinion, the reason behind all sorts of human rights violations we see in the West Bank is the settlements. Settlements are at the heart of what this conflict is all about. Somebody had a question about, suggesting that if Palestinian children stopped throwing stones, they will not be arrested and abused. I want to go back one step and say, if settlements were not built in occupied territories, there will be no conflict, maybe. Certainly, at least from the evidence that we collect, I mentioned the majority of the children are arrested within 800 meters from a settlement. And the military commander's almost impossible job is to protect these, I don't know the number now, 700,000 settlers wandering around in occupied territory among millions of Palestinians. They take their land, they take their roads, different laws apply to them, they live a different living standard. It's visual. You stand on one village, and you look over to the settlement across the street, 500 meters away. In that village, there's hardly any water in the taps. And across the hill in a settlement, kids are splashing in swimming pools. I mean, this is a very simple example, on top of, all the war crimes that these settlements represent and all the other violations. So a short answer to your question, I think the settlements are the epicenter of all of this.
Dani, did you want to say something on that, or leave it with that?
Yeah, well, I concur, of course, with Salwa. The settlements are a very, very big problem on the ground, and of course, they're the heart of troubles. And of course, if you detain so many kids in this violent way, and you terrorize communities, it's a way of controlling the population. People are afraid. People are scared. They hold their heads down. And we haven't started talking about, well, Salwa did mention that in short, the need of many Palestinian families, because the West Bank is socioeconomically much less privileged than Israel proper. So many Palestinians need to enter Israel to work. They need permits for that. So when you need the military authorities, you will try to behave, so to speak, and not get into trouble. And getting into trouble is, of course, bad for your well-being. So if you are brutal and enter villages and raid houses and detain youth, so you have everybody complacent and quiet and afraid, and you control the population. You have no trouble, no problems for controlling them, even brutally. So this is a very unfortunate thing, and I have to say that the Palestinians are bravely trying to resist. But people want to live and they want to work, and they understand that they're living in a very harsh reality. And I always say that there is a sense of quiet here. If we're talking about these grave abuses of human rights, the Palestinian population, we're living in some kind of normal situation. Me as a Jew in Jerusalem, I don't feel that my security is at risk at all. And I guess that this brutalization of the population has a very deep effect on how the population deals with the situation it's in. So it's a very effective form of control. And Israel does not seem to want to stop.
Okay, thank you.
Peter,
Mariana, is that you speaking?
yes.
Yeah.
I just wonder if I could explain for people who might not know a lot about this. When we say settlers, we're often referring to Canadians and Americans who have moved to Israel. So it's not just people that have always been living in Israel and they moved over to the settlements. People are immigrating to become settlers. So we have to think about that responsibility on our part as well.
Thanks, Mariana. Salwa, in your Laurie asked a question about some recommendations you made in your presentation. She wonders what's happening to the recommendations, where they're going to, who's going to take action on them. Can you just say a word about that?
Yeah, that's a very important question. So we are a very small organization with very little, limited power. So what our objective is to encourage or facilitate or help voices bigger than ours to, sing from the same sheet, basically to call for the same recommendations. In 2013, UNICEF wrote a very important comprehensive report, and they basically adopted or made 38 recommendations. I mean, some of them could be summarized in the 6 recommendations that we call for. So that was a very important step, a United Nations organization calling for these recommendations. And it caused, some Israeli officials were very upset by that report, and there was like a dialogue for some time, but then everything fizzled. So part of our job is to basically keep that UNICEF report alive and to keep reminding people of those recommendations. A similar initiative happened from the UK. A high-ranking senior lawyers from the UK visited the region, and they wrote a very important report, with also a number of recommendations along the same lines. We speak to, or before COVID at least, we spoke to about 150 delegations each year. Some of them included elected officials, some lawyers, some UN agencies, church groups, activists, university students, Jewish students. And each one of these groups or individuals would go back to their country and do something. Some governments have decided to take on the issue of child detainees. I know, for example, the UK government took it upon themselves to insist that every lawyer consults with, every child consults with a lawyer. And I must say some improvement happened in that one point, but it's still not enough. But this is how change sometimes happen. It never goes from 0 to 100. It goes through phases, and then it's, one step forward, 1,000 steps backwards. And this is our job, to never lose hope, to keep at it, to keep insisting on what we insist on, to keep reminding everybody, to provide information. If we drop the ball, people like Dani's organization or my organization and dozens others, nobody will probably, mention anything. This is our job, is to not lose hope when things don't look good.
Salwa, you mentioned that the UK had done some things. I think a little bit later, Marianne is going to talk a little bit about the Canadian campaign here and what her objectives are to hopefully try to get the Canadian government to play a little bit more of a proactive role on that. Dani, you mentioned that somehow Palestinian kids contact you, or parents contact you to find out where their kids are. That presumably, that first of all, that means you have some Arab receptive capability, you have some ability to talk to the parents somehow in your organization. And then the question here from Rebecca is, how are Palestinian teens able to access legal representation? Do you represent them, or do you help them find or do they have representation? What's the deal there from a legal perspective?
Well, to your first question, yes, we of course have Arab speakers who they are in charge of the intake of calls. They're all Palestinians, citizens or residents of Israel, and they start the process of opening a file that we deal with later. Your second question regarding the legal counsel that we at Hamoked, we don't represent minors or adults in the military courts. We basically just trace, monitor, and then when they're already incarcerated in prison, we visit them and try to focus on their conditions of detention. We've found that counseling in the courts for us was not really feasible work-wise. There are many difficulties in the military courts. Most of these kids get a counsel from the Palestinian Prisoner Club. They have in-house lawyers that they send to the military courts, and they give counsel to the minors. As Salwa said, in this point, counsel during interrogation, there has been some kind of change lately. There are the police interrogators sometimes have lists of counselors that they call when a kid is in interrogation, and the kids have a chance to speak to a lawyer prior to interrogation. I'll try to be very careful here. The way that things are conducted in the military courts are not good, put it mildly. The counseling is not the best, and because the numbers are so big, so many files are open, so many minors are being taken in detention. It's like a processing plant.
How many? Remind us how many in a year or a month or whatever. Give us some statistics.
Well, around 1,000 something minors, only minors a year are processed by the system. And you have thousands of adults as well. We're talking only about minors, but of course, if you're 25 or 30, you also have basic rights, and you have a right to legal counsel. And when you have I don't know, thousands of detentions a year and thousands of legal processes a year, it's very difficult to have a proper legal process. So this is why, and because the system is built, it's another important point, the system is built that once you're captured, once you're put in detention, you won't leave detention until you're released from prison. There is no bail, there is no parole, there is no kind of, you'll wait in your house while the trial is ongoing, you'll stay in prison. So most people just want to get out of prison as fast as they can. So they sign plea bargains. And the system is a plea bargain system. You just say you did whatever they say, and your lawyer signs a plea bargain. You have no actual trial. And yeah, it's a very problematic system. Yeah.
Salwa, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing, that my organization also, does not provide legal aid to children for the reason that Dani mentioned. It's like a kangaroo court. It's not about justice or due process. If you, once COVID is behind us and you visit, I would love to take as many of you as possible to the military courts to see for yourselves. But the other point I wanted to mention is, as Dani said, at the moment, the legal counsel are provided by Palestinian NGOs or Palestinian ministry. And whereas I think providing legal aid and legal counsel to these children should be the responsibility of the Israeli government. In every country, public defenders are paid for by taxpayers. And as until that happens, the Israeli, when will the Israeli citizen or sitting in Tel Aviv feel the impact of this occupation? Definitely not when Palestinians or donors, actually, basically it is donor money that goes to these Palestinian organizations that provide below standard legal aid to these Palestinians, whereas I think the government should be paying these expenses.
While we're on that, somebody asked a question about what the food is like in prison, but more generally, what are the conditions of detention like? Salwa,
may I mention, a recent testimony we took from a child. He said he was given a piece of chicken with feathers on it, and unripe rice, uncooked rice with uncooked beans. And some kids, I must say, this is not in prison. This is prior to making it to prison. This is during the interrogation, which can take weeks. And more recently, we noticed a surge in the number of boys put in solitary confinement for weeks, sometimes up to 3 weeks. And that's where the food is terrible. In prison, I think food gets a little better. And believe it or not, the prisoners cook their own food. First of all, it gives them something to do. They like it. Some boys tell me they like it. And second of all, secondly, they cook the food they like, and the way they, sometimes they have to buy ingredients from the canteen, which their parents deposit money for. So it's a user pay system, basically, from legal counsel to the meals that these boys eat. Everything is paid for. That is why things will not change and the system will not end or collapse. That's the tragedy of all of it. And sometimes donors make these mistakes. Everybody wants to do something and everybody wants the system to change. But we sometimes throw money in the wrong place. And we sometimes perpetuate a bad situation. And we sometimes, I don't know, it's out of, I don't know what it is, but we are partly to blame. Parents constantly complain to me about the lawyers that show up in these courts. They don't pick up their phones. I mean, this is a generalization, not every single lawyer, of course, but it's very bad.
In my introduction,
give the impression that all the faults and mistakes and the deficiencies are on the other side. We are partly to blame. And when I say we Palestinians, we Canadians, probably we British, everyone.
So in my presentation, I give a little picture there of Ahed Tamimi, Palestinian girl who was arrested and so on. I assume that overwhelmingly we're talking about boys, but are there special issues relating to Palestinian girls who get arrested? Are there any special considerations here?
As you said, the majority of the children are boys, aged 12 to 17 inclusive. Very few girls end up in the system. I think we haven't had a girl in the system since December 2018, if I remember correctly. So no girls this year yet, no girls in 2020, no girls in 2019. And what it tends to be for girls is a different issue. It's a social or something is happening at home. So we had a girl who kept showing up in the military court, month after month. And it turned out there was some kind of abuse at home, and she wanted to get out of that situation at home by, I don't know, crossing a checkpoint with a kitchen knife in her backpack. I don't remember exact details, but this is what some girls would do. Cross a checkpoint with a, I don't know, sharp instrument, and then the metal detector will detect it. The girl will be stopped, accused of attempting to stab a soldier. And this is exactly what that girl wanted, is to be arrested and to be put in prison so that, she's out of the even worse situation at home. And that's another tragedy. Yeah. Wow. I mean, some girls, of course, were arrested for, Ahed Tamimi was arrested for assaulting a soldier, and her mother too was arrested for incitement, I think. And another girl was put in prison for throwing stones at settler cars, but that's the minority of the cases.
Question about the international rights of the child. We're talking, there's some kind of document or statement defining the international rights of the child. Dani, you as a lawyer might be able to, how does that play here at all, or is it just ignored? What's
the Convention on the Rights of the Child is an international human rights law convention from 1981, I think, if I remember correctly. Israel is a signatory and a party to the convention, but like all other instruments of international human rights law, Israel's stance is that these, since the occupied territories are not part of Israel proper, legally speaking, formally speaking, then Israel says it does not apply the conventions to the occupied Palestinian territory. They do not apply. So the Palestinian population is not protected by international human rights law conventions, according to Israel. So inside Israel, you have problems, of course, but Israel is obliged to report to the Committee on the Rights of the Child once every couple of years. It has to submit reports, it has to answer to questions, but it always states that what happens in the territories is not under the auspices of this convention or the committee that is in charge. We, of course, completely are opposed to this. Not only we, the International Human Rights Community, International Court of Justice, UN, what have you, everybody apart from Israel thinks that the conventions apply in the West Bank. You cannot fathom a situation where a whole population, millions of people, are unprotected because of a legal framing of the status of the territory. It's something you can't accept. So of course, we always, in our petitions and our claims, we always base our argumentation on international human rights law, on the Convention of the Rights of the Child. The Israeli youth law actually is based on this convention. And so we always state that the norms that should be the basis for the military law as well should be based on this convention. It's not implemented.
Sure.
By Israel.
Salwa, do you want to add something on that, or is that okay?
No, that's fine.
Okay. We are now getting close to our end. We have about 9 minutes left. I see that a number of people have asked a question: how do we get this information circulated more broadly in Canada and the United States? How do we get North American Jews to be more aware of what's going on? we have 120 people on the attending the webinar today, which is a drop in the bucket in Canada. This will, of course, be recorded, is being recorded, and you will all get a copy of the recording. And one thing you can do is to circulate it to your friends. But with that, I will loop back and thank Salwa and Dani in a moment, but I want to ask Mariana to tell us a bit more about the campaign. And if I'm working properly here, I should be able to, yes, share and come down here. Mariana, would you give us a bit of information about the Canada Stand Up for Palestinian Children's Rights campaign?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you both of you for those excellent talks that you gave. I first want to say that many people are shocked when they hear this story about Palestinian children for the first time. And for those who have heard it over and over, it's tempting to feel helpless, overwhelmed, and disgusted. And Salwa pointed out how important it is to keep your hope and to keep carrying on. And if there's anything I've learned from Palestinians, it is exactly that, the value of sumud, persistence. So we have a group of Canadians who are committed to taking action to do what we can to stop this treatment of children. And it is this group, Canada Stand Up for Palestinian Children's Right campaign. What we do is we share letters, which you can adapt and send to your MP and to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to educate them about what is happening and to ask the Parliament to appoint a special envoy whose work would be to investigate what's happening and share that finding with Parliament and with Canadians. On November 28th and 29th, we are encouraging people to participate across Canada in a public action. We will design postcards and give you resources about the children being arrested and info sheet and a letter. And we want people to be out in public places handing this out to people. We really want to ask you to become active in whatever way works for you. So you can sign up to receive the letter. You'll get information about how to do that and learn more about the campaign. You can sign up to participate in the public witness. Sign up if you'd like to help organize a public witness in your area. Kathy's going to be doing one in the Kitchener area. Tell your friends and family and communities of faith what you've learned today. And of course, you can share the link. Together, if we persevere, we can move the Canadian government to raise this abuse of children's rights with the government of Israel. So thanks so much, and we look forward to hearing from many of you today.
Thank you, Mariana. And it's now my turn to thank, first of all, our panelists, Mariana and Dorcas and Kathy, for helping me prepare this, and congratulate them on the work that they're doing. A great shout out to both Salwa and Dani for staying up late in Jerusalem to talk to us, pushing your children, Dani, off into the background. We appreciate it. They're very quiet. They wish my kids were like that. Actually, my kids are your age, my grandkids. I wish they were like that. We will be, as I say, be sending this a follow-up email to all of you, which will include links to both Salwa's and Dani's organization, as well as links to the campaign that Mariana just talked about. And if a reminder to you that this today was organized by the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. It's a not-for-profit organization. We're funded by out of our own pockets and out of donations. So if you feel encouraging us, we will send you a link to it where you can send a small donation, and our Secretary Treasurer will be very happy to dump it into our bank account to cover our ongoing expenses. We've also said to both Dani and Salwa, we would make a contribution, financial contribution to their organizations. So your contribution to us will be also funneled through to them as well. So Dani and Salwa, do you have any final words you want to say to misled Canadians who need to know more about this issue? Dani?
well, these kinds of activities, like the webinars you've organized, are a very important tool. I think having this platform, the Zoom platform, I told you previously that I find it a bit dry, but it does have the power to outreach many more people than we can gather in one room. And so we can, hopefully people will know more about the situation here and try to press, because the Canadian government can have a lot of leeway and say regarding what Israel does. We don't hear the Canadian stance very often, or not at all, I don't know, here in Israel. So keep up the good work.
Salwa.
Same message from me. Thank you, everyone, to the organizers and the panelists and the participants. I think knowledge is just the beginning. It's not the end.
Yeah.
But if we have the power of knowledge, we will come up with creative ways to make effect, to make change, however small. Nothing is too small.
Well,
And I think Canada has something to teach us, like as a country, and we talked about that before as well, how you face this colonial settler issue, having a bilingual attitude. We have lessons to be learned from Canada, and you should be active to show us the road, to the path ahead, because we're two peoples living in this land. We have to find some sort of way to be able to live together on equal grounds, and we can learn from other people around the world how to do that.
Well, Dani, you're absolutely right. That is the shared intention, but it is a difficult struggle, and we have a long ways to go in Canada as well. So we don't have very many lessons to teach to anybody else, but we're very happy to share our experiences. With that, I think I'm going to just say goodbye. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you to our two invited guests. Good luck to everybody and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.